A racist officer humiliates and arrests an elderly black veteran, thinking he can get away with it. But when the veteran's son, a royal guard, arrives at the station, everything changes. The bell above the diner door jingled softly as Charlie Green stepped inside. He adjusted his worn olive green coat, its edges frayed from years of use, and glanced around. The place smelled of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon, a simple comfort he looked forward to. He gave a polite nod to the waitress behind the counter and chose a small table by the window, away from the few other patrons scattered across the diner. Charlie sat with quiet dignity, his weathered hands resting on the table as he scanned the menu, though he already knew he'd just order coffee. He had lived a life of discipline, of respect. Today was no different. He wasn't there to make noise, just to enjoy a warm drink and wait for his son, Marcus, who was running late. But as he sat, Charlie couldn't ignore the sideways glances, the whispers exchanged between the other customers. It wasn't the first time he'd felt it, the subtle message that he didn't belong. He had learned to brush it off over the years, to focus on the things that mattered. But then, the door jingled again, and a different kind of presence entered the room. Officer Stark strode in, his boots heavy on the linoleum floor. He scanned the diner like he owned the place, his gaze landing on Charlie with a sharp, calculating intensity. Charlie didn't flinch, meeting the officer's eyes briefly before looking back down at the menu. But Stark wasn't about to let it go. "Something I can help you with?" Stark asked, his tone carrying an edge that made the waitress behind the counter freeze in place. "No, sir," Charlie replied evenly, keeping his voice calm. "Just here for some coffee, waiting on my son." Stark scoffed, taking a step closer. "Your son, huh? Don't see too many folks like you around here. How long you plan on waiting?" Charlie looked up, his calm exterior masking the faint unease growing in his chest. "As long as it takes." The officer snorted, his lips curling into a smirk. "This isn't a place for loitering. People get nervous, you know." Charlie tightened his hands on the table, but kept his voice steady. "I'm not bothering anyone." Stark leaned in closer, his shadow falling over Charlie's coffee cup. "Mind showing me some ID? Just to make sure you're not causing trouble." Charlie sighed softly, but reached into his pocket, pulling out his veteran ID. He handed it over without a word, watching as Stark barely glanced at it before tossing it back onto the table with a sneer. "A vet, huh? Not sure I'm buying it." The words stung more than they should have, but Charlie remained composed. "It's the truth." "Well," Stark said, his smirk widening, "people like you always have a story, don't they? But let me tell you something, you're in the wrong place." Charlie felt a flicker of anger rise in his chest, but forced it down. He'd faced worse in his time. "I'm here for coffee, officer. That's all." Stark leaned in so close Charlie could smell the faint tang of coffee on his breath. "Maybe it's time you left before I have to make you." The tension in the diner was palpable now, the other patrons watching but saying nothing. Charlie's jaw tightened, but he refused to back down. "I'm not moving," he said quietly. "Not until my son gets here." Stark's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening. The challenge was set. Charlie knew this wasn't going to end easily, but he wouldn't let this man strip him of his dignity. Not today. Charlie sat in his chair, staring out the diner window as the tension between him and Officer Stark thickened. The officer stood over him, arms crossed, his sneer growing wider with every second of Charlie's quiet defiance. Charlie had seen men like Stark before, men who thrived on power, who used their authority to belittle others. He'd faced them on battlefields, in life, and now, in the seemingly mundane walls of a small-town diner. "You're really testing my patience, old man," Stark said, leaning closer, his voice low and sharp. "I told you, people like you don't belong here." Charlie kept his voice even, though his hands tightened around the edge of the table. "I'm just waiting for my son, officer. That's all. I'm not breaking any laws." "Breaking laws?" Stark barked a bitter laugh. "You think you're above them, don't you? Sitting here like you own the place." His eyes flicked to the patrons nearby, some of whom were now pretending not to watch, their gazes darting nervously between their coffee cups and the confrontation. "No one's going to stand up for you, old man," Stark hissed. Charlie said nothing, choosing silence as his armor. But Stark wasn't finished. His smirk twisted into something uglier, a sneer of contempt. He reached forward and shoved the table hard, sending Charlie's coffee spilling across the surface and onto his coat. Charlie flinched slightly, then looked down at the dark stain spreading across the fabric of his lap. Slowly, he looked back up, his jaw tightening as he met Stark's gaze. "Was that necessary?" he asked, his voice still calm, but edged with steel. "Necessary?" Stark spat the word as he leaned closer, his shadow falling over Charlie. "You don't get to ask questions. You're nothing but trouble. Always have been." Then, with deliberate cruelty, Stark spit on Charlie's coat. The glob landed heavily, glistening against the already stained fabric. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The sound of forks clinking against plates stopped, conversations hushed, and all eyes turned toward the scene. Charlie's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. His composure, honed by years of service and experience, threatened to break under the weight of this humiliation. But he took a deep breath, steadying himself. He would not give Stark the satisfaction of a reaction. "You think that makes you a man?" Charlie asked, his voice low but unwavering. "Spitting on someone? Humiliating them in front of others?" Stark's sneer faltered for a brief second, but he quickly masked it with mock laughter. "I think it makes it clear who's in charge here. And it's not you." The officer grabbed Charlie's arm roughly, yanking him from his seat. The chair scraped loudly against the linoleum floor, the sound jarring in the otherwise silent diner. Charlie stumbled slightly but straightened himself, refusing to look anything less than dignified. "Let go of me," Charlie said, his voice firm. Stark's grip tightened. "You're under arrest," he growled. "For what?" Charlie demanded, his voice rising slightly. "Having coffee? Sitting quietly? For disturbing the peace and refusing to leave when asked?" Stark snapped back. "And I don't need to explain myself to you." Stark dragged Charlie toward the door, his movements harsh and unrelenting. Charlie didn't resist, though his body ached from the officer's rough treatment. Behind them, the patrons sat frozen, their faces a mix of unease and fear. Some looked as though they wanted to speak up, but none did. Their silence felt heavier than the humiliation Charlie endured. Outside, the cold air hit Charlie's face as Stark marched him toward the squad car parked at the curb. Stark shoved him roughly against the hood, forcing Charlie's arms behind his back as he snapped on handcuffs. "You think you're tough," Charlie muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "What was that?" Stark snarled, leaning closer. "I said," Charlie repeated, his voice firm now, "you think you're tough. But you're just a coward." Stark's face turned red with anger, and for a moment it looked like he might strike Charlie. But instead, he shoved him toward the back seat of the squad car and slammed the door shut. Inside, Charlie sat stiffly, his wrists aching from the cuffs. He stared straight ahead, refusing to let the humiliation overwhelm him. He had faced worse. And he knew one thing with certainty: his son would not let this stand. The police station hummed with subdued activity as officers went about their routine. Stark leaned against the front desk, smirking as he recounted the earlier incident at the diner to a colleague. His self-satisfaction was palpable, as though he'd accomplished something more than manhandling an elderly man and throwing him into a cell. Then the heavy wooden doors of the station swung open, and the atmosphere shifted. Marcus Green entered the room, his tall, imposing figure clad in the dark, meticulously tailored uniform of the Royal Guard. His boots clicked against the polished floor with a deliberate rhythm, and his posture was as precise as it was commanding. Conversations faltered, heads turned, and an unspoken ripple of respect swept through the room. Marcus' eyes were sharp, scanning the station as he approached the desk. His demeanor was calm, but there was an unmistakable intensity behind his gaze, a controlled fury simmering beneath the surface. When he reached the desk, the officer behind it stiffened instinctively. "I'm here to see Charlie Green," Marcus said, his voice even but carrying the weight of authority. "He's my father." The desk officer blinked in surprise, fumbling with the logbook. He's in holding," the officer stammered, clearly caught off guard. "One moment, sir." From his spot nearby, Stark's smirk faltered as he straightened up, his brow furrowing. He stepped forward, glancing at Marcus' uniform, but clearly not grasping its significance. "What's this about?" Stark asked, his tone casual but tinged with arrogance. "You related to the guy in the cell?" Marcus turned to face him, his eyes narrowing slightly as he sized up the officer. "I'm his son," Marcus said, his tone sharp and to the point. "And he'd like to know why he's been arrested." Stark scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Your father?" "He was causing a disturbance at the diner. Refused to leave when asked, acted like he owned the place. Had to bring him in." Marcus' jaw tightened, though his face remained composed. "A disturbance?" he repeated, his voice low, but with a dangerous edge. He was sitting quietly, having coffee. Stark shrugged dismissively. People were uncomfortable. He wouldn't cooperate. "I followed procedure." "Procedure?" Marcus' tone sharpened. He took a step closer, and though he didn't raise his voice, the sheer authority in it made Stark falter. "Did procedure include spitting on him? Shoving him? Humiliating a man who has served this country with honor?" Stark hesitated, his confident facade beginning to crack. "Look, I didn't know who he was." Marcus' eyes flashed. "You didn't know?" His voice was cold now, the calm exterior hardening. "You didn't know he was my father, or you didn't care that he's a veteran? That he's a human being deserving of respect?" Stark opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus cut him off, his voice ringing out like a blade slicing through the room. "The man you humiliated is my father, and you will answer for it." The color drained from Stark's face as the weight of Marcus' words hit him. The royal guard standing before him wasn't just another angry relative. He was a man who carried authority and influence far beyond what Stark could comprehend. The station fell silent, every eye on Marcus and the now visibly shaken Stark. For the first time, Stark was at a loss for words, and Marcus stepped closer, his piercing gaze holding the officer in place. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next move, Officer Stark," Marcus said, his voice quiet but deadly. "Because this isn't over." The tension in the police station was palpable as Marcus Green stood in the center of the room, his presence commanding every officer's attention. The silence was thick, the weight of what was about to unfold heavy on everyone's shoulders. Officer Stark stood to the side, his smug demeanor from earlier replaced with unease, though he still attempted to maintain an air of bravado. Marcus' piercing gaze swept across the room, landing squarely on Stark. His voice, calm but laced with authority, cut through the silence. "Officer Stark, step forward." Stark hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if searching for an ally. But the officers surrounding him kept their gazes averted, unwilling to meet his eyes. Finally, he straightened his uniform and stepped forward, trying to project confidence. "Captain Green," he began, his tone cautious, "I was just doing my job." Marcus' expression didn't waver. Doing your job? He repeated, his voice steady but sharp. Your job is to uphold the law, protect citizens, and treat them with respect. What you did to my father was none of those things. Stark's jaw tightened, but he tried to defend himself. Your father was being disruptive. He wouldn't leave when I asked. I had to take action. Marcus took a deliberate step closer, his towering figure making Stark visibly uneasy. Disruptive? He was sitting at a diner, quietly having coffee. The only person who caused a disturbance was you. You singled him out because of his skin color, harassed him, spat on him, and then arrested him on false pretenses. That is not doing your job. That is abusing your power. A murmur spread through the room as the gathered officers exchanged uneasy glances. Stark's face reddened, and he clenched his fists. I didn't know he was your father, he said defensively. I didn't mean for it to escalate. Marcus' voice rose slightly, carrying an edge of righteous anger. Whether or not you knew he was my father is irrelevant. You saw a man you thought you could push around, someone you assumed wouldn't fight back. You thought no one would care what happened to him. But you were wrong. Stark opened his mouth to argue, but Marcus didn't give him the chance. Let me be clear, Officer Stark. Your actions weren't a mistake or a misunderstanding. They were deliberate, driven by prejudice and a belief that your badge makes you untouchable. But that badge is not a license to demean, abuse, or intimidate. It's a responsibility you have failed to uphold. At that moment, the doors to the station opened, and two representatives from Internal Affairs entered, their presence adding gravity to the situation. Marcus gestured toward them. They're here to ensure that what happened today is documented and addressed. Your actions will not go unnoticed or unpunished. Stark's confidence crumbled entirely as the Internal Affairs officers approached. Marcus' voice softened but remained firm. You've disgraced the uniform you wear and the values it stands for. There's no place for that in this department or any department. As Stark was led away for questioning, Marcus turned to the other officers in the room. Let this be a reminder. Justice is not about power, but accountability. If anyone here thinks they're above the law, think again. Because I won't stand for it. The room was silent, but the message was clear. Marcus had not only defended his father, but also upheld the principles of justice, leaving a powerful example for everyone in the department to follow. The atmosphere in the station was thick with tension as Officer Stark stood in front of the gathered officers, his face pale and his arrogance long gone. The decision from Internal Affairs was swift and unequivocal. Stark had been found guilty of gross misconduct and abuse of power. The consequences were immediate. He was formally stripped of his badge and relieved of duty. As Stark stood motionless, Internal Affairs agents escorted him toward the exit. The once confident officer now looked small and defeated, his head hanging low as whispers rippled through the station. Officers watched silently, some with grim satisfaction, others with quiet reflection. The man who had once used his badge as a shield for his prejudice was now leaving in disgrace, a stark reminder of the accountability their uniform demanded. In the holding area, Charlie Green sat patiently, his composure unshaken despite the humiliating ordeal he had endured. When the cell door opened and Marcus stepped in, Charlie stood, meeting his son's steady gaze. A faint smile tugged at the corners of Charlie's lips as he saw the resolute pride in Marcus' eyes. "Dad," Marcus said softly, his voice filled with reassurance, "you're free to go. Justice has been served." Charlie nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice calm but carrying a depth of gratitude. "I knew you'd do the right thing." As Marcus escorted Charlie out of the station, the other officers stood at attention, some nodding respectfully as the veteran passed. Marcus stopped at the center of the room, turning to address his colleagues. His voice was firm, but carried the weight of his conviction. "Let what happened here today be a reminder," Marcus began, his gaze sweeping across the room. "This badge isn't a symbol of power. It's a commitment to serve, protect, and uphold justice. Anyone who cannot honor that commitment has no place in this department." The officers nodded solemnly, absorbing the gravity of his words. Marcus continued, "We are here to serve all people, with integrity and respect. That is not optional, it's our duty." As Charlie and Marcus left the station together, a quiet sense of victory hung in the air. The fight against prejudice wasn't over, but today, justice had prevailed. Outside the station, the cool evening air greeted Charlie and Marcus as they stepped into the quiet street. The tension of the day began to ease as they walked side by side. Charlie stopped near a bench, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. Marcus noticed his father's quiet demeanor and paused, giving him space. Charlie finally broke the silence, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You didn't just stand up for me today, Marcus. You stood up for every person who's been treated like they don't belong." "I couldn't be prouder." Marcus looked down, humbled by his father's words. "Dad, everything I've done, every lesson I've learned about what's right, I learned from you. Your sacrifices, your strength, you've set an example I could only hope to live up to." Charlie smiled, the pride evident in his weathered face. "Today, you showed me that you're not just living up to it, you're surpassing it. You didn't just fight for me, Marcus. You fought for what's right." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "I've always known the badge comes with responsibility, Dad. But seeing how Stark abused it made me realize how much more there is to do. It's not just about upholding the law, it's about standing against injustice, no matter where it comes from." Charlie placed a hand on his son's shoulder, squeezing it gently. "The world needs more people like you, Marcus. People who use their position to lift others up, not tear them down. You've honored the sacrifices of everyone who fought for equality, for justice." Marcus' gaze softened, and he smiled. "I learned from the best, Dad." As they stood together, the night sky above them, the moment felt symbolic, 2 generations united by shared principles, determination, and love. The struggles they had faced today weren't unique, but they were a reminder that the fight for justice and respect never truly ends. Charlie straightened, his voice steady but full of hope. "This isn't the end of the fight, son. It's just the beginning. But I know with people like you in the world, there's hope." Marcus nodded. "I'll keep fighting, Dad. For you, for the people who need someone to stand up for them, and for what's right." The 2 men shared a heartfelt embrace, a symbol of their bond and shared commitment to justice. As they parted ways for the evening, Marcus turned back, his voice carrying a note of encouragement. "For anyone watching this, remember that standing up against injustice matters. It starts with us. And if you believe in making a difference, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and join the conversation. Together, we can create a better world." With that, they walked away, leaving behind the events of the day but carrying forward their shared mission. A sense of hope lingered in the air, a reminder that justice, though often hard-won, is always worth fighting for.